in class 3, we're going to talk about equalization. Now, in the EQ process, primarily, what we're really getting to is starting off with subtractive EQ, filters, right? So when I look at different sounds here, I do a lot of shaping that's kind of negative, filtering signals away, right? So as I'll just kind of call up just some of the individual plugin settings right here, oops, and work with it from this level, right? So some of these things, like let's just kind of call up like a kick drum, right? EQ, right? So with a kick drum, I may do some things where I kind of, depending upon the sound, I may do some additive EQ as well, a little shelving, focus in the fundamental of the kick drum, like that type of thing. And with different sounds, I may have different things in place, right? Where do I filter? Where do I pull away? How am I basically shaping the sound as I'm going along here so that, when I go from instrument to instrument, right, what frequencies are not necessary? You have an acoustic guitar, maybe it doesn't need anything below 100 cycles, so you filter it off because whatever is there is actually making, even if it's just a tiny little bit, the cumulative effect of that, if you have 3 or 4 guitars in the track that don't need those frequencies, is going to make the bass less distinct. You're not going to hear the detail of the bass, and then you're going to end up adding lots of high end to the bass, and then it's going to sound all pokey and weird, right? So you filter away stuff that's unnecessary. Maybe with overhead mics, right? You filter some of the low frequencies out, right? Because you don't really need a ton of the low frequencies, right? If not, maybe they're really just capturing the cymbals, or maybe they're just capturing the presence of the kit. Maybe there's a boxiness in them, so you pull out a little bit of 500 to get rid of some of the boxiness, right? So it makes the snare sound full. And you kind of work subtractively at first and start to build it and shape things, right? So you're really preparing the mix in terms of kind of think of it like puzzle pieces. You've done your basic levels and panning, and the pieces are basically in place, but they don't really fit together. So if you think about building a puzzle, what you do is you look at the picture of the puzzle, right? You look at the what it is, and you say, oh, gee, all the sky is up at the top. So let me gather all the blue pieces and move them up to the top over here on the table. And then I'll take, there's this, big clay pot over here to the left. So I'm going to take all the pieces that are the color of the clay pot and move them over here. And that's all you're doing, right? You're just moving things basically in the area where you want to lay them out. But now you have to put all the pieces together. And so the EQ is a way of shaping or cutting all those pieces and getting them to fit together. So mud is like a big thing, right? So the subtractive element is really important. And it's very important that you're not taking away what essentially makes an instrument work, right? So in other words, if you have a Fender Rhodes and you're rolling off low frequencies all the way up to like 300 cycles, you're completely sucking away what a Fender Rhodes does, right? All that warmth and that low mid energy has to be there, right, in order for it to sound like a Fender Rhodes, right? So there, you're not going to, you can't do that. But let's say you have a flute, like a piccolo flute. Now, a piccolo flute doesn't need 100 cycles on it. So you can filter that off. So because there may be some rumble, there may be some of the breath or the wind that's blowing into the microphone. There's like a low frequency energy in there. Maybe there's a little bit of noise or rumble, right, from air conditioning or something in the room that you're picking up. So you're filtering it. It doesn't affect the sound. It actually makes the sound of the flute more natural, more focused, right? And it also, just getting rid of that low-level stuff times 20 tracks, 30 tracks, 40 tracks, and getting rid of the stuff that's unnecessary, that's noisy, kind of carving away those little things, all of a sudden pulls everything into focus, right? And you start to hear a bit more separation in detail of the individual instruments. The instrument that all of this work, especially the low frequency low cut, is that it makes the bass much more defined, right? It really brings out the bass, which is the most difficult instrument probably to get detailed and heard really cleanly. And low-end keyboards like Fender Rhodes, like very hard to get the detail. So you carve away the other stuff that gets in that way, right? And that helps you to move things up and down, right, in the speakers as well, right? So the equalization characteristic is really important. And then you have to know when to add additive EQ, right? Vintage EQs are important because they maintain certain vintage EQs have components that add a density to certain frequency areas. So a lot of vintage equalizers, the reason why you go to say like a Neve vintage EQ is because it has transformers in it, and those transformers add a low mid density and warmth and body. So if you have an electric guitar that's lacking warmth and body, then and you need to EQ it, instead of just trying to EQ in some low mids, which will never sound right, you put something that actually is adding a harmonic distortion in the low mids really well, and that adds some density. So now when you swing in a little bit of that 200, you're only adding like a dB or two instead of 5 dB, and it actually sounds more pleasing because the warmth and density that's added with the transformers helps to thicken the sound. The same reason why you would use an EQ that has or a different reason might be you use an EQ that has tubes in it, and that would add low frequency and a high frequency sizzle, and that adds size. You always talk about tubes making things bigger, right? And that's a big part of it. And so these different components add a different sonic characteristic, and the shapes of the filters are really unique with certain instruments, like the Pultecs, right? And or with certain instruments, and not instruments with certain equalizers, right? The vintage EQs. And we'll talk about that and where and when you use those, right? And we'll really get into a practical approach of how you apply equalization to a mix, right? That's really the key there. All right, so that's class 3.